Hello, my name is Rick. Before I met my fiancée, I believed that money cannot buy love. Now, I'm not that naive. But we'll come back to that. Nina appeared in my life when I was 18. I'd just started attending a college in my hometown, and I loved to study at a cafe nearby. One day, as usual, I went over for a cup of limitless coffee and Wi-Fi, and my heart skipped a beat. New waitress, Nina. The most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Blonde hair, green eyes, perfect figure. She apologized for her strange accent right away. She was 20 and had just moved here from a small Ukrainian town because she had won a green card lottery. Her boss was generous enough to hire her, even though her English wasn't perfect. I was completely charmed. Since that day, I used any excuse to return to the cafe. I noticed that Nina's boss was treating her in kind of a rough manner because she was clumsy. We used to chat for a while sometimes in the cafe, and after a couple of times, I finally asked for her number and we started texting. And then one day, she called me in tears, asking me to pick her up at the cafe as soon as possible. It was the first time that I saw Nina in her casual clothes, without her waitress uniform. She was sitting outside and crying. Her boss had fired her that day. In addition to that, her landlord was stalking her and had threatened to kick her out of her rented apartment because she refused to go out with him. I felt so sorry for Nina. She was very attractive. It was no wonder that those perverts tried to abuse their power. I wanted to protect Nina from all that cruelty, so I suggested that she pack her bags immediately and move into our guest house. I lived with my parents, my older sister, and my granny in our family residence, which is very spacious and luxurious. You see, my great-grandparents created a very prosperous business that had been passed down from generation to generation. Our family residence is one of the keys to our family's heritage. My parents are very conservative and sophisticated people. They collect art and porcelain and love these collections more than their own children. As for my granny, she was very old and sick, and doctors said that she only had a few months left, so my parents hired a full-time nurse to take care of her. Granny was a very complicated character, but I tried to maintain a positive relationship with her because she was going to bequeath me a solid fortune. It sounds mean, I know, but I really counted on this money because I wanted to invest in my own company in the future. My parents didn't support my goals. They wanted me to continue with the family traditions. So, when I brought Nina home that evening, my family was shocked. But good manners didn't allow them to kick her out right away. She moved into the guest house, located in a garden behind the main building. Nina was very impressed. I said she could stay for as long as she needed in order to get her life together. When we were alone, she kissed me. She told me she had fallen in love with me at first sight. I couldn't believe my luck, and we finally crossed the line between friendship and romance and started dating. It was the happiest time of my life. We had dinners at the best restaurants. I bought her new clothes and paid for her language courses. Oh, I also moved into the guest house, and we had our own little paradise. I abandoned my studies at college, but I didn't care because my plan was to get my inheritance from my granny and invest it. I shared my plans with Nina, and she was very supportive. Although Granny was still alive, she was getting worse and worse. Don't get me wrong, I'm not obsessed with money. She was laying in a room surrounded by all this medical equipment, and I visited her regularly. I even introduced her to Nina. Grandma didn't seem happy, and neither did my parents. When I started dating Nina, my family was very skeptical. Especially my sister. They dropped hints that Nina was just an ordinary gold digger and didn't love me at all. But that sounded ridiculous to me. Nina was the most innocent and modest person I'd ever met, and she never demanded money. All the gifts that I bought for her, I bought voluntarily. She was having trouble getting a new job, and I used my credit cards to support the both of us financially. I knew that I was going to be able to repay all my debt after I get my inheritance. So, I spent money on Nina with no limitations. One day, we discussed Nina's green card issues. I noticed that she was stressing out, and I got this genius idea to marry her, not only to ease the process of obtaining a residence permit, but because I loved this woman and thought that she was the one. I spent a lot of money on a beautiful engagement ring with a yellow diamond. This color matched her hair perfectly, and proposed to her during a dinner. She said yes. She was so excited to start planning our fancy wedding. When I told my parents about the engagement, it was a disaster. My mother and my sister yelled at me. They said it was a huge mistake. But my father finally stepped in and said it was my personal choice. Exactly. Nothing could keep me and Nina from loving each other. Apparently, nothing except my granny. After the engagement, Granny's health got much worse, and she passed away. I was very upset. During the funeral, the whole family became a little closer and warmed up to each other. But then our family lawyer announced that he was going to read Granny's last will and testament. The only way for me to inherit her money was to marry after I reached the age of 23. That was Granny's last will. And there was no opportunity to challenge this condition. She had never warned me about this document. Nobody had. Later that night, in the guest house, I told Nina about the situation with the inheritance and asked to postpone the wedding for 5 years. For the first time, I faced Nina's crazy side. Nina was desperate. She cried, saying that I never loved her, that I just used her just like everybody else. She threw things all over the place. I couldn't believe my eyes. My beautiful, modest fiancé had turned into a monster. She rushed at me, trying to scratch my face. I had to throw her away from me, on the bed like a mad cat, and hide in the bathroom. Nina pounded on the door, screaming and crying. When she calmed down a little, I left my sanctuary and poured drinks for the both of us. A phone call distracted me. When I returned to the room, Nina was holding her glass. She apologized and offered to toast to our future. I was glad to see her mood had improved, and I drank my whole glass. The next day, I was woken up by a call from my sister. I could barely remember the details of the previous evening. She asked me to come over to the house. My parents were panicking and screaming at our housemaid. Several expensive pieces from their antique porcelain collection were gone. At that moment, I realized that I hadn't seen Nina in the guest house. She took all her stuff, including the ring, and left while I was sleeping. I tried to call her, but she had blocked my number. I couldn't believe it. My heart was broken. I had a very tough conversation with my parents. They wanted to call the police to find Nina and the stolen items. I begged them not to do that. I was still hoping that she would return and explain everything. I didn't want to create problems for her. She could have been deported forever. Finally, my parents agreed. My mom told me, "I warned you about this, girl. Thank God we stored jewelry in a locked safe." After that day, I fell into a depression for several months. I tried to find Nina, but she had just disappeared. None of her friends had seen her since that day. And then suddenly, my friend Nancy sent me this picture from a nightclub, asking whether Nina had a twin sister. In the background of this picture, I saw a waitress, and it was Nina. Black-haired Nina. I was so excited. Finally, I could get the answers to my questions. The club was in another city, 4 hours away from my place, so I decided to go over there and surprise her. When I arrived, the club was not crowded. I saw Nina at the bar. I had no doubts that it was her. Suddenly, a guy came up to her and they kissed. I got crazy and angry. I decided to go over and say hello. She tried to hide her fear while the guy asked, "Alina, who is this?" Alina introduced me as a very, very old friend. He shook my hand and said his name was Nick. He was Alina's fiancé. Nick pointed to her hand with a diamond engagement ring. This guy seemed wealthy and older than me. I felt sorry for him and asked how long they had known each other. Nina gazed at me furiously, took my hand, and invited me to go outside for a few words. Outside? She asked me to forget about her forever. She said that if I said anything about us to her new groom or anybody else, she would go to the police and media and tell everybody a horrible story about a poor Ukrainian immigrant girl who was locked in my house against her will and witnessed the murder of my granny. She literally threatened me and accused me of killing my grandmother because of my inheritance. Her eyes were completely insane. I could not believe she was the same Nina who I once fell in love with. She told me that she would be glad to keep my family secrets if I keep hers. Then she just pushed me and left. Nina said something to the security guards and they wouldn't let me in anymore. Obviously, she was bluffing. So I ran into a dilemma. To tell or not to tell Nick. But he was a stranger to me. Well, my family could get into a serious scandal because of this crazy girl. I decided to back off and discuss it with our family lawyer and my parents. The lawyer was cynical and advised me to satisfy Nina's demands, to leave her alone, and also to thank God that we didn't get married. My parents wanted to protect the family from any sort of publicity and agreed to forgive her theft. It was hard, but I decided to keep silent and move on with my life. But I often remember Nina and Nick and ask myself how they're doing.